For over 100 years, there was one address every COGIC saint knew by heart: 930 Mason Street. Memphis, Tennessee. That's where Charles Harrison Mason built Mason Temple. That's where the Church of God in Christ was born. That's where, every single year, tens of thousands of saints packed their bags, booked their hotels, and made the pilgrimage. Because Memphis wasn't just a city to COGIC, Memphis was home. And now, the General Assembly has voted to walk away from it. Not forever, they say, not completely. But for the next 3 years, the biggest gathering in Pentecostal Christianity, the Holy Convocation, will not be held in Memphis. It's headed to St. Louis, and underneath that one decision is a much bigger story about money, about growth, about a denomination of 6.5 million people trying to figure out who they want to be in this next chapter. Bishop J. Drew Sheard says it wasn't easy. The city of Memphis says they're heartbroken. Local businesses say they're about to lose tens of millions of dollars. And inside the church itself, there are saints asking a hard question. If COGIC can leave Memphis, what does that mean for the soul of this movement? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what was decided, why it happened, who fought to stop it, who's celebrating it, and what it means for churches, your church maybe, all across this country. Let's get into it. Who is COGIC and why does this matter if you're not familiar with the Church of God in Christ? Let me catch you up quickly, because you need this context to understand just how massive this decision really is. COGIC is the largest Pentecostal denomination in the United States, and one of the largest Black-led religious organizations on the planet. We're talking about a body with somewhere around 6.5 million members worldwide, thousands of local churches, dozens of jurisdictions, and a history that stretches back to 1907 when Bishop Charles Harrison Mason established the church in Memphis, Tennessee, right there on Mason Street. Mason Temple isn't just a church building, it's sacred ground in American history. It's the same sanctuary where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his final speech, "I've been to the mountaintop," the night before he was assassinated. That building carries the weight of the civil rights movement and the weight of COGIC's entire spiritual identity in the same walls. So when people talk about COGIC's Holy Convocation, they're not talking about some regional conference. They're talking about the denomination's premier, once-a-year, international gathering. A multi-day, sometimes multi-week event where bishops, pastors, missionaries, youth, and everyday members from literally every continent converge for preaching, teaching, prayer, business meetings, and a level of worship experience you cannot replicate anywhere else in American Christianity. Every year, the Holy Convocation brings in tens of thousands of attendees. We're talking numbers that swing between 30,000 and 60,000 people, depending on the year and the host city. That is a citywide event. Hotels fill up. Restaurants are slammed. Rideshare drivers can't keep up. Local economies feel it in a real, measurable way, which is exactly why this next part of the story matters so much. The decision here's what actually happened. In January of 2025, during a special session, delegates of the COGIC General Assembly, that's the legislative, law-making body of the entire denomination, voted to move the Holy Convocation out of Memphis and relocate it to St. Louis, Missouri for a 3-year run covering 2026, 2027, and 2028. Let that sink in for a second. Memphis has hosted this event for well over a century. It is, quite literally, the birthplace of the church. And the General Assembly, the body made up of bishops, pastors, elders, missionaries, and lay delegates from across the country, voted to leave. So why would they do that? According to COGIC's own statement, the church engaged in what they called multiple discussions and extensive negotiations with the city of Memphis, trying to work out satisfactory conditions to keep the convocation there long term. But in the end, those negotiations fell apart. The denomination said they were unable to secure the terms they needed, and the General Assembly's delegation ultimately voted against continuing in Memphis beyond 2025. Bishop Brandon Porter, a member of COGIC's General Board, was blunt about the core issue when he spoke with reporters. He said the city needed to step up, better hotel accommodations, more competitive room rates, and frankly, a downtown infrastructure that could actually handle the sheer size of what COGIC brings every year. When you're trying to house, feed, and move 30 to 60,000 people through a downtown corridor for a week or two straight, you need serious hotel inventory. and Memphis's downtown hotel capacity had reportedly been declining, not growing. Think about that from a logistics standpoint. This isn't just about vibes or sentiment. This is about whether a city can physically support an event of this magnitude. And according to COGIC leadership, Memphis, for whatever combination of reasons, declining hotel stock, pricing, general conference friendliness, couldn't close the gap. Now, St. Louis, on the other hand, made COGIC an offer they apparently couldn't refuse. St. Louis had already hosted the Holy Convocation once before, from 2010 to 2019, a full decade before the event moved back to Memphis. So this isn't unfamiliar territory. St. Louis knows how to host COGIC, and COGIC knows what St. Louis can provide. And here's a detail that matters a lot. St. Louis's convention center, America's Center, had recently been expanded. Local tourism officials didn't hide how badly they wanted this deal. Bob Wallace, the interim president of Explore St. Louis, put the economic impact in real numbers. He said COGIC's Holy Convocation represents something like $83 million a year in economic impact for the St. Louis region. Multiply that across the 3-year deal, and you're looking at roughly $250 million flowing into that city's hotels, restaurants, transportation, and retail. $250 million. That's the kind of number that makes mayors show up to press conferences personally. And that's exactly what happened. St. Louis Mayor Tashora Jones and local officials publicly celebrated the announcement, standing at America's Center alongside COGIC representatives, including Bishop Keith Kershaw, the church's chief operating officer, who talked about how diligently the Explore St. Louis team had worked to bring the Holy Convocation to that newly expanded venue. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, the tone was very, very different. Memphis Mayor Paul Young released a statement acknowledging the deep history and significance COGIC holds for the city. He said the city was saddened by the decision but respected COGIC's choice, and that Memphis would continue to honor the legacy the church built there. But underneath that polished mayoral language, there was real economic anxiety on the ground. COGIC's convocation in Memphis had historically pumped somewhere around $35 million into the local economy every year it was held there. That's not small money for a city like Memphis. That's hotel workers, restaurant staff, small retailers, transportation companies, an entire ecosystem of local jobs and small businesses that depend on those 2 weeks every year. Ernest Strickland, the president and CEO of the Black Business Association of Memphis, spoke candidly about what this move would cost. He pointed out that it's not just the big hotel chains that take a hit. It's the small food vendors, the local transportation operators, the independent retailers who count on that influx of tens of thousands of visitors to hit their annual revenue targets. When an event like this leaves, it doesn't just leave a gap on the calendar, it leaves a hole in people's actual livelihoods. Dr. Anthony Coleman, a Memphis area COGIC pastor, tried to put a more hopeful spin on it, saying transitions happen and that the church didn't necessarily want to leave. But the reality of the logistics forced their hand. And here's something important that a lot of headlines glossed over. This wasn't actually the first time this exact scenario played out. COGIC had already left Memphis for St. Louis once before, back in 2010, for similar accommodation reasons, and then returned to Memphis a decade later. So in COGIC's own institutional memory, this pattern, leave, come back, leave again, isn't unprecedented. It's part of an ongoing, sometimes tense relationship between a growing global church and a hometown that has struggled to keep pace with its needs. Bishop Porter even hinted that COGIC might rotate other, smaller conferences into Memphis while the main Holy Convocation is away in St. Louis, a kind of consolation move to keep some economic activity flowing into the city that still houses the church's world headquarters. But let's be honest about what this really represents. For COGIC members, Mason Temple is sacred. Memphis is sacred. This is the ground Bishop Mason walked. This is the sanctuary where Dr. King gave his final address. There's an emotional and spiritual weight to this city that no amount of hotel square footage in St. Louis can fully replace. Which is exactly why COGIC leadership went out of their way to reassure the church family that this is not a permanent departure. The one last homecoming before the move to St. Louis officially took effect, COGIC gave Memphis one final moment, the 117th Holy Convocation, held in November of 2025, right back in the Bluff City, right at Mason Temple. one last time before the 3-year St. Louis run began. And by all accounts, it was emotional. Bishop Charles Harrison Mason Patterson, the great-grandson of the church's founder, spoke about how the roots of COGIC's ministries stretch out from Memphis to the entire world. For thousands of saints who showed up that November, it wasn't just another convocation. It was a homecoming with a goodbye built into it. Bishop Patterson even expressed real optimism that the convocation would eventually find its way back to Memphis for good, saying the spiritual and historical connection to the city ensures COGIC will always maintain a presence there, regardless of where the annual convocation is physically held. His message was clear: Memphis is not losing COGIC. Memphis is COGIC's home. The headquarters isn't moving. The convocation is just traveling for a season. Still, when you closed out that 117th Holy Convocation, there was a bittersweet undertone running through the whole event, because everybody in that room knew this was the last time, for at least 3 years, that the saints would gather at Mason Temple for the big one. Now the 118th Holy Convocation is set to be held in St. Louis, Missouri, running from roughly November 3rd through November 10th of 2026, with the General Assembly's official business session tacked onto the tail end of it. That means, come this November, the entire denomination's center of gravity physically shifts north, up the Mississippi River, to a brand new expanded convention center that's ready and waiting. Why this is bigger than a venue change now? Here's why I think this story deserves way more attention than it's gotten. This isn't just a scheduling change. This is a signal about where COGIC sees its future. Think about what it took to actually make this decision. The General Assembly is the highest legislative body in the entire denomination. It's made up of bishops, pastors, elders, missionaries, and lay delegates from jurisdictions all over the country. For that body to vote, and by most reports, it was described as an overwhelming mutual decision to move the church's flagship event away from its founding city, that tells you something about how seriously COGIC's leadership is thinking about scale, infrastructure, and the long-term financial health of the organization. This is a denomination that is thinking like a modern institution. It's weighing hotel capacity. It's negotiating with city governments. It's comparing economic impact numbers between competing metro areas. It's making decisions the way a major convention or a professional sports league might make decisions about where to host its biggest annual event. And that matters, because COGIC, under Bishop Sheard's leadership, has been making a lot of moves like this. Decisions that reflect a broader push toward financial discipline and long-term stability. Bishop J. Drew Sheard's leadership. Let's talk about the man at the center of all of this, because you can't understand this decision without understanding who's steering the ship. Bishop J. Drew Sheard was elected presiding bishop of the Church of God in Christ back in 2021, taking over as the chief apostle and top leader of this global denomination. He's the pastor of Greater Emmanuel Institutional Church of God in Christ in Detroit, a position he's held since 1988. He's a former math teacher with degrees from Wayne State University, a bachelor's in education and a master's in mathematics. And if you follow gospel music at all, you probably already know his wife, Karen Clark Sheard, member of the legendary Grammy-winning gospel group, the Clark Sisters. Their daughter, Kiara Sheard, has carved out her own successful career in gospel and R&B. In November of 2024, the General Assembly re-elected Bishop Sheard to a second term as presiding bishop, a vote of confidence that solidified his authority to keep pushing his agenda for the church. And what does that agenda look like? A few things stand out. First, financial stewardship. Bishop Sheard has been credited with eliminating the Church of God and Christ's entire organizational debt in 2024. For a denomination the size of COGIC, wiping out institutional debt is a massive accomplishment, and it tells you a lot about the financial discipline he's trying to instill at the top levels of leadership. When you understand that context, the Memphis to St. Louis decision starts to make a lot more sense. This is a leadership team that is actively negotiating for better financial terms wherever they can find them, whether that's paying down debt or squeezing better hosting conditions out of a city bidding for their business. Second, community partnerships. Bishop Sheard formed a partnership with the Tennessee Governor's Office, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, and Shelby County to provide transitional housing for youth entering the state's foster care system. That's the kind of civic engagement that shows COGIC isn't just an internal, insular religious body, It's actively trying to be a force in public policy and social services, especially in and around its Memphis home base. Third, managing internal church politics. Leading a denomination with 6.5 million members and dozens of jurisdictions is not simple. Bishop Sheard has had to manage a range of strong, outspoken bishops across the country, some of whom have generated their own headlines and controversies. Balancing that many powerful personalities while still pushing through major institutional changes, like relocating the church's flagship event, takes real political skill inside the church structure. So when the General Assembly voted to leave Memphis, it wasn't a rogue decision made in isolation. It was consistent with a broader pattern of Bishop Sheard's administration. Make the hard financial calls, even when they're emotionally difficult, because the long-term health of the institution depends on it. The other decisions churches need to know about now the Memphis to St. Louis move is the headline, but it's not the only major decision coming out of COGIC's General Assembly and General Board that's affecting churches across the country right now. Let me walk you through a few more, because if you're part of a COGIC congregation, or even if you just follow religious institutional news, these matter too. The 2026 Leadership Conference reschedule. Early this year, a severe winter storm swept across the country, threatening travel conditions nationwide right around the time the Leadership Conference was set to happen in Little Rock, Arkansas. Bishop Sheard, alongside Leadership Conference Chairman Bishop Charles McClelland and the General Board, made the call to reschedule the entire conference out of an abundance of caution for the safety of church members traveling by air and by car. That included pushing back the service of Episcopal consecration and installation, a major ceremonial event where new bishops are formally installed, to a new date in mid-February. This might sound like a minor logistical footnote, but for the bishops and their families waiting on that installation ceremony, and for the thousands of delegates who had already booked travel to Little Rock, this was a significant, last-minute disruption that leadership had to manage delicately. The General Assembly's expanding legislative role. It's worth understanding just how much power actually sits inside the General Assembly. This is the body that creates the laws and rules governing the entire denomination. It's the only body with the authority to establish new jurisdictions, amend the official church manual, and make binding decisions like the Memphis relocation. Delegates are elected at the jurisdictional level. Bishops, supervisors, pastors, elders, district missionaries, and lay delegates all have a voice in that room. Understanding that structure helps explain why the Memphis decision carried so much institutional weight. It wasn't Bishop Sheard acting unilaterally, it was the entire representative body of the church, voting as one. Continued expansion into new jurisdictions. COGIC has also continued the process of evaluating and approving new jurisdictions around the country, a process that requires General Board review and, ultimately, General Assembly approval. As local church growth continues in different regions, this administrative machinery keeps churning in the background, largely unnoticed by anyone outside the denomination, but incredibly consequential for pastors and congregations hoping to formalize new regional structures. Upcoming events shaping 2026 and beyond. Beyond the Holy Convocation move, COGIC's calendar for 2026 includes the Bishops' Conference in September, out in Indian Springs, California, and then that all-important 118th Holy Convocation in St. Louis come November. Looking further out, the church has already locked in Portland, Oregon to host the 77th Annual Women's International Convention in 2027. All of this signals a denomination that is thinking regionally, spreading its footprint beyond its traditional southern base, and building relationships with cities across the country that are actively competing to host these massive, revenue-generating gatherings. What this means for churches nationwide, so let's zoom out. What does all of this actually mean if you're sitting in a COGIC pew somewhere in Georgia, or California, or Ohio, watching this unfold from a distance? It means the era of assuming Memphis will always host the big event is over, at least for now. Local churches that have built entire ministry trips, youth outreach programs, and fundraising cycles around an annual pilgrimage to Memphis are going to have to recalibrate their travel budgets and logistics for St. Louis instead, for at least the next 3 years. It means individual pastors and jurisdictional leaders now have real, tangible proof that the General Assembly is willing to make financially driven, sometimes emotionally difficult decisions in the name of institutional health. That precedent matters. It tells local leadership across the country that decisions at the top are increasingly guided by data, negotiation leverage, and long-term sustainability, not just tradition for tradition's sake. It means economic ripple effects for two entire metro regions. Memphis is bracing to lose tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue tied to the convocation. St. Louis is gearing up to gain hundreds of millions over the 3-year run. Local businesses, hotel workers, and civic leaders in both cities are watching this play out in real time. And it's a case study in just how much economic power a major religious denomination can wield when it moves its flagship event. And it means COGIC's broader trajectory, debt elimination, aggressive negotiation with host cities, expanded civic partnerships, and continued institutional growth is likely to keep shaping decisions like this one for years to come. Bishop Sheard's second term isn't slowing down. If anything, this Memphis to St. Louis decision suggests he's just getting started on reshaping how this 6.5 million member denomination operates on a national stage. How the Saints are reacting now. Official statements from bishops and mayors are one thing, but let's talk about how everyday members of the church are actually processing this news, because the reaction has been mixed, to say the least. On one side, you've got longtime members, people who have been making the trip to Memphis for 20, 30, even 40 years, who feel a real sense of loss. For a lot of families, the Holy Convocation in Memphis wasn't just a religious obligation. It was a tradition passed down through generations. Grandparents brought their children, who grew up and brought their own children, all making that same walk into Mason Temple, all sitting in those same historic pews where Bishop Mason once preached, and where Dr. King delivered his final words. For those families, hearing that the convocation is relocating, even temporarily, feels like losing a piece of their spiritual inheritance. On the other side, you've got a growing number of members, especially younger saints and delegates from jurisdictions outside the South, who see this as a practical, even overdue decision. They point out that St. Louis already proved itself as a capable host city for a full decade, from 2010 to 2019. They point to the newly expanded America Center as a legitimate upgrade in facilities. And frankly, a lot of delegates who've dealt with overbooked hotels, inflated pricing, and logistical headaches in downtown Memphis in recent years are relieved to hear the church is prioritizing the actual on-the-ground experience of its members over sentimental attachment to one city. There's also a financial argument that resonates with a lot of local church leaders, especially smaller congregations that have to budget carefully for these annual trips. If St. Louis genuinely offers better hotel rates, better transportation infrastructure, and a smoother overall experience, that translates directly into real savings for churches sending delegations from across the country. When you're talking about groups of 10, 20, even 50 members traveling together from a single local church, hotel pricing differences add up fast. Social media reaction, unsurprisingly, has run the full spectrum. You've got posts mourning what feels like the end of an era in Memphis. You've got posts celebrating the upgrade to St. Louis's facilities. And you've got a healthy dose of church members simply asking logistical questions: how to book hotels early, what the surrounding jurisdictional events will look like, and whether smaller regional conferences might still rotate through Memphis in the meantime, the way Bishop Porter suggested. What's clear across nearly every conversation, though, is that almost nobody is questioning COGIC's spiritual commitment to Memphis itself. The debate isn't about whether Memphis matters. Everyone agrees it does. The debate is about whether an annual convention of this scale can realistically continue to be hosted there under current conditions, and on that question, the General Assembly has already spoken. Frequently asked questions before we wrap up. Let me answer a few quick questions I know a lot of you are going to have. Is COGIC's world headquarters moving to St. Louis? No. The organizational headquarters remains at Mason Temple, on Mason Street in Memphis. Only the annual Holy Convocation event is relocating for the 2026 through 2028 cycle. Could the Holy Convocation return to Memphis after 2028? Based on comments from church leaders, including Bishop Charles Harrison Mason Patterson, that possibility is very much on the table. COGIC has moved the convocation away from Memphis before, back in 2010, and returned a decade later. There's no reason to assume this current move is permanent. Will smaller COGIC events still happen in Memphis during this period? Quite possibly. Bishop Brandon Porter indicated that the denomination may rotate other, smaller conferences through Memphis while the main Holy Convocation is held in St. Louis as a way of maintaining some economic activity and presence in the city. When exactly is the next Holy Convocation, and where? The 118th Holy Convocation is scheduled for St. Louis, Missouri, running in early November 2026, with the General Assembly's business session following immediately afterward. So here's where things stand. Memphis, the birthplace of the Church of God in Christ, the city that gave us Mason Temple and carries the memory of Dr. King's final speech, is stepping back from hosting the Holy Convocation for at least the next 3 years. St. Louis, with its newly expanded convention center and an eager city government ready to roll out the red carpet, is stepping in. Bishop J. Drew Sheard and the General Assembly made this call with their eyes wide open, knowing it would upset some saints, knowing it would hurt Memphis's economy, and knowing it would spark exactly the kind of conversation we're having right now. But they made it anyway, because in their eyes, the long-term health and growth of this denomination depends on being willing to make hard, unsentimental decisions when the moment calls for it. Whether this ends up being a temporary detour or the start of a permanent shift, one thing is clear. This is, without question, one of the biggest institutional decisions the Church of God in Christ has made in years. And come this November, when tens of thousands of saints pour into St. Louis for the 118th Holy Convocation, we'll get our first real look at how this new chapter plays out. If this video gave you the full picture, do me a favor, hit that like button, drop a comment, and let me know what you think about the move, whether you're a lifelong COGIC member or you're just discovering this story for the first time. And subscribe, because we're going to keep tracking this story all the way through November, when this new era officially begins in St. Louis. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.